Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Talin Keshishan, and today I'm hosting a town hall about our Armenian American community. LAC USC Medical Center and DHS value diversity, equity, and inclusion. April is a very important month for our Armenian American community, and specifically April 24th, which is the commemoration day for the Armenian genocide. This town hall is going to have many wonderful guests, including Dr. Shushan Karapetian, Dr. Alina Dorian, Dr. Arman Dorian, Sevak Ohanian, and Richard Elmoyan. Our panelists include members not only in the medical community, but also in the Armenian community. The Armenian diaspora here in Southern California, specifically Los Angeles, is the largest community of Armenians outside of Armenia. And as such, we wanted to have a panel that included all members of our community. So thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Dr. Dorian. How are you?
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here today. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you've gotten to where you are today?
Oh, wow. So I am of Armenian descent, first generation, born in the United States, actually Glendale, California, maybe the first Armenian born in Glendale. Born and raised in LA. I went to a small private Armenian school, Holy Martyrs, or Ferayan, as some know. Graduated from there, went to UCLA for undergrad, then went to the University of Hawaii for medical school, then went back to UCLA for my residency in emergency medicine and trauma. And then subsequent to that, I worked in many different hospitals and became a partner in a group here in Glendale at Verdugo Hills Hospital. This hospital was subsequently purchased by USC and then became faculty at USC. Then I went back to school, got a business degree at USC, and became the chief medical officer. And now for the last 2 months, I've become the chief executive or interim chief executive officer here at USC Verdugo Hills Hospital. That's kind of a snippet. There's a lot of other things that I do, which involve media and some stuff in kind of entrepreneurism, as well as a lot of things that I try to do for my home people, my Armenians. And so that makes me very grounded and very important for me to do literally on a daily basis.
For those listeners who don't know about the Armenian genocide, can you maybe give us a little bit about your thoughts and feelings?
Well, I think the core of being Armenian starts with one of the major events in their history, which was being the first Christian nation. And that act really solidified its identity as being different in that region. And many times they were persecuted because of their beliefs. We see today in our current environment here in the United States that people are persecuted for their own beliefs or the color of their skin. And we have unfortunately had that same plight in where we were in Armenia, to the point where there was an organized government instituted fact of trying to annihilate our entire race. That is something that is, if you don't remember or acknowledge, will continue to recur. And we see that happen not once or twice. It literally happens yearly. Many of the times we are not familiar with what's happening in the world, but it happens regularly. And to the fact that we were just in an atrocity, the same people that suffered the genocide just a few months ago. And again, though we brought it to light that this was an organized attempt at eliminating people from their homeland, it seems like the world turned a blind eye.
This occurred in September of 2020. That's when it started. And it lasted for 44 days regarding active war zone, and then resulted in basically the loss of homes, of land, of a people. And now we're left with the aftermath. Can you talk about what was going on in Artsakh and how that is important today?
Well, when you talk about devastation, there's many layers of devastation that occurred because of the aggressive behavior of Azerbaijan attacking the people who just wanted peace in Artsakh, who've been there for thousands of years and had no intent on leaving. But having said that, they were attacked, and there was the immediate atrocity where from a new type of warfare, which is drone driven, which is high explosives, not gunshot wounds that we would normally think from previous wars. And the sadder part, besides the fact that there was human carnage and human humans who died was the way in which it was a young generation, like in many wars, who were maimed. And this is between 16, 17-year-olds to 21-year-old males who went out to try to defend their moms, their sisters, and their families who were killed. And a significant portion of that population lost that generation. And we're going to have a deficit for years to come because of those people who were lost. And then you take the next level of the people who survived and saw what occurred and how they lose confidence in the human race, if nothing else, that this could happen, and nobody was there to help. So there's so many layers to this atrocity that happened in Artsakh that for us in the diaspora to sit and watch was very painful.
Yeah, we talk about this idea of intergenerational trauma, essentially, is what you're mentioning. And I know for myself, for example, I also went to an Armenian school and learned about our history and our culture and our heritage. And we're talking about a genocide that occurred over 100 years ago. That still to this day isn't formally fully recognized by the United States government. Although throughout the world, it has been from many different countries. And then you talk about something that happened just a few months ago that changed how we think, especially the youth, how the Armenian youth and the first generations here and the second generations here in the United States think about their culture, their heritage, their history, and how they connect to it. Something that happened so long ago now became very relevant today and caused its own trauma. How do you think the youth have now connected these two instances?
It's difficult for them to connect with the genocide because it was stories, and the stories, you put your own imagery, you put your own story, visual in your mind when you haven't been there or seen it. But this war, or this, as you call it, human crisis, that when they attacked Artsakh was not something they needed to imagine. It was right there, and it was very visible, and we were able to watch it unfold. The trauma will be, like you said, many generational. I mean, it'll survive for generations. But I'm hopeful. The one gene that I know that we possess as a people is survival, and so I'm hopeful that while there's a lot of negative feelings right now towards the way everything kind of played out or is playing out, it will only make us even more galvanized as a people and understanding that we have to stop waiting for others for help, and we have to help ourselves and get ourselves to a point where we are in control. And I think this younger generation senses that even more than we've ever felt, because we've always felt that we always need others to get us to where we need to get to. And I think the younger generation is a lot more independent, a lot more, I think, aggressive. And it's partly the way they're educated and partly that they have everything at their fingertips. They feel like with a few changes here and there, they may be able to solve this problem. And I'm very hopeful for that.
I know that you are involved in a lot of efforts. Can you maybe talk about those?
Yeah, sure. I mean, let's just talk about it from being Armenian. And as soon as the war started, I wanted to be able to help in any which way possible. My sister, she actually wrote the initial health plan for Artsakh and lived there post the war. And I was one of the first physicians, or actually volunteers, that went to Artsakh literally with a backpack to try and help anybody I could. So I had been to Artsakh a lot, and I had developed basically family style roots there. And so as soon as this occurred, I knew exactly what was happening, and I knew the people that were being affected, and I knew that without our support, they've got no chance. So, me, along with pretty much everybody else, felt that the need to do something. And I did what I could from, what is within my control.
It's interesting. During that time, I was speaking with a lot of different physicians of different specialties of Armenian descent. And the universal theme was hopelessness, despair, and helplessness, despite all the efforts. I wonder if you felt that way at times.
Yeah, probably that would cycle through, every minute by minute, you would go through those types of emotions of, you felt helpless, hopeless, but the only way you can kind of break through that is by trying to be active and doing something.
Now let's talk about April 24th. It's coming right around the corner. Why is that such an important date for the Armenian community? And why is it so important this year?
Well, I mean, it's important every year, but this year is extremely important because of the recent events. Well, look, April 24th is even bigger than the genocide for us. It's really become our national day of proof of survival. And it's become what we have rallied around. Some almost joke that if it does get recognized, what do we do now? Well, because we now survived? And the truth, the answer is no. It's not about just the recognition. It's about the recognition, the reparation, and all the things that come with that. Because the first step towards healing is actually acknowledging the fact that there was something that occurred.
So we are joined by Alina Dorian, the Associate Dean for Public Health Practice and Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. She is also the principal of Rose and Alex Pilipos Armenian School. Hi, Alina.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Have you?
Oh, exciting.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be who you are today?
Oh, wow, that's a long story, half a century old. So I think probably the most important thing is I did my elementary and high school in an Armenian school. Funny enough, I was at Pilibos, by the way, elementary, so full circle back as principal, kind of crazy, then Berayan. And then went to UCLA, did my undergrad there in biology. But while I was doing that, I was really sort of trying to figure out where I fit in the health world. Was it a physician? Was it public health? Which, by the way, I didn't even know what public health was until somebody said to me, I think what you want to do is public health. And I was like, what is that? Interesting. And then I actually ended up majoring in botany. So thinking that I wanted to be a shaman. A lot of people know this story. I thought that was going to be my route into medicine. And then spent some time traveling and really honestly working in biology, but botany, and thinking about sort of medicinal plants, et cetera, that world. And then fell into public health, went to Johns Hopkins, did my doctorate there in international health, but really focusing mostly on disasters, but really like disaster to development. What does that look like? And then in 1994, went to Artsakh, right after ceasefire, to help them write their first national health plan. So did that, and then spent years working in Artsakh at that time through the American Red Cross. I also worked at the American Red Cross in Washington, D.C., and then I have 3 boys, but I had my second and realized I need my family. So moved back to LA and then had the joy of becoming faculty at UCLA and have been here ever since, and then had my 3rd son. And so that's sort of the long way around of where I am.
Point of this podcast today is to recognize that we have a huge Armenian community here in Southern California, and that there is a very significant thing that happens in April, especially April 24th, and it means a lot to the Armenian community here. I would probably say more so this year than ever before, given everything that happened last year. Maybe you can talk to us about the Armenian community and what you have seen, and why is it so important today? How does it affect them?
So, I mean, coming back to the Armenian genocide, which is what, the commemoration that we do on April 24th, and realizing that, more than a century ago when it occurred until now, the United States government officially is not recognized. And, that is of huge importance, not just to the Armenian people, but to the globe, right? It comes back to really this recognition of injustice, of an indigenous population that was removed forcibly from their lands and what that looks like. And just understanding that, we can't get to a just society until awareness is there, reckoning is there, and then we're able to actually rebuild, right? And really think about what that means for the population. So this year, which is happening coming up on Saturday, it's even more important because we, I think, feel very alone in many ways in the recognition of our history, right? And that's a scary feeling on the planet. Like, you don't really think that way, you know, you always think good's going to prevail and justice is going to do, and we're working towards it. I mean, it's not going to just poof magically happen. I mean, even yesterday with the verdict, it doesn't mean that the verdict creates justice, right? It means it's a signal that we need to keep working and doing what we need to do.
It's a step.
Yeah, it's a step, but it's a step in a really long, long journey. And so, but this recognition is a step in our journey, like my personal journey, but a personal journey that should mean something for everybody on the planet. This is not just for Armenians. This is the recognition of the first genocide of the 20th century that still hasn't been recognized.
You know, you mentioned this intergenerational trauma. We're talking about the genocide happened over 100 years ago, and we're still trying to break that silence. And now we're talking about a new trauma for the new generation, the youth, that maybe they were talking about stories of their great grandparents, and now they experienced it firsthand themselves. How do we as a community help support one another, Armenian or not? You know, we're all a society here together. How can we support ourselves? Because you're right, a lot of us felt alone, helpless, hopeless. How can we get out of that?
So I'm a super optimist, by the way, in everything I do. So, and I am also, and everybody knows that, a super crybaby. So I may cry as I start telling you what we need to do, right? And as a principal, I'm also super strong in what we need to do, right? Incident commander, as I always say. So I think that the biggest thing was this reckoning that it could happen again. I think that piece is something that we, even me, right? I am so second, my grandfather's family was in the genocide, right? And I'm first generation born in America. And so even for me, it's been a story, even though a close story, because my grandfather has told me with his own mouth, with his own, you know, years. But for my kids, they didn't hear from my grandfather, right? So for them, it really is a story. It's a generational story being told, but they do understand the importance of it. And, you know, having in 1991 a country called Armenia, which we didn't have ahead of time, you know, we sort of shifted in, let's build this country and let's really think about what this is. And we'll focus on all of the other things. We can't forget them, our lands and where they're from. And, you know, my middle son is named Vaughn specifically because we were from Vaughn, which is lands lost, you know, and so it's ingrained in just his name and who he is and how we think about it. But I think for my kids, the most important reality was, wait, this is actually happening right now. Even for us, it became oh my goodness, could this really be, you know, could this really be the end of this, my people, this people that have been on this planet for 3,000 years, you know, the beginning of the end. And I think it's coming to terms with that, which means we do need to realize that all threats against people, all threats to justice are so real. Like they just, you know, and they are not, and so that brought up in me and my parents who are still alive, a different kind of trauma, like a trauma that we've lived, yes, sort of vicariously or secondhand, but it opened all of that. And I remember just sort of thinking through, you know, as a child, I would hoard anything Armenian because I didn't have access to it, right? So if I saw an Armenian book that I probably would never read and didn't have any interest in the topic, but because it was Armenian, it was something I would keep because what if there won't be another Armenian, right? But then Armenia country, we started thinking or changed a little bit of that trauma mentality. But then all of a sudden it came back to me and I was like, especially me working in Artsakh, I was like, I got married in Shushi. I got married in the church, Gananchjam, which was just destroyed and razed to the ground. I would have never expected my church, that's where I got married, that I won't see it again, right? So real, I mean, those are real. It's not a story, it's real, it's my story, right? So I think we need to start understanding how to address these things. But more importantly, there's an even more imperative mission of really, really establishing this genocide and the recognition of it, so that we, I feel, would be able to prevent, hopefully, another one from happening. And not just ours, obviously, of any genocide.
Well, what can we do? If you're listening to this podcast and you are inspired, you want to help, what can we do? Where do we go?
Well, so there's a lot that we can do, right? I mean, I always say the first thing is just to be a good human and realize, like, I'm serious about that. You know, we always think with our head, but it's most important to think with our heart, right? And so I know that sounds very hocus pocusy, but I think that that's also why public health is so important. That's why actually being a principal for me is so important, because it comes back down to that validation of importance of every single human life and what that means. But as an Armenian, there's so much we can do now, even more now, right? We have such wounds and, things that we need to take care of from the war. There's a lot of issues in Artsakh. We lost a lot of land. There's a lot of displaced persons living in Stepanakert without, they left with nothing. So really thinking about that loss of their, homes, but also loss of identity, not to mention loss of life. Right? We have so many soldiers, but also just youth, the young, right? We probably will have this group of, right now, 17 to 20-year-olds that we lost a lot of young boys in that, young men in that category. And what that would look like moving forward is going to be something we need to think about, right? As a people and just as a country developing. And there's a lot that we can do in the sense of coming back to, again, our identity and the recognition of the genocide, but also our identity as Armenians in helping the entire world cope with injustice. I think that there's a sense of obligation to that, that I think we should take very seriously. And you mentioned something before we started when you were saying, oh, how do you do some of these things? And I really believe that so much of where I come from, and I will say my brother comes from, is this idea of wanting to make our people proud, right? So this is where I'll start crying, but this idea that I always joke, I always say, people would say, oh, you went to an Armenian school. And I say, yeah, I went to an Armenian school. And then I went to the best schools after that. And I was able to do everything I was able to do, and I say that with such pride because, just like I tell my students, be the best whatever you're gonna be, but always remember you represent your people. I tell my varsity team, basketball team, in a small, it's a cosmos of what I'm trying to say is when they go to play basketball, I say people may forget the name Pilibos on your shirt, but boy, they'll remember Armenian school. So remember that when you're there, you not only represent yourself and your family in this school, but you really represent your ancestors and what that means in just sort of the actions you take in this world.
Absolutely.
Hopefully that helps.
It does help. And it does help. And Dr. Dorian, I really want to thank you for everything that you do. We're joined by Richard Elmoyan, who is an independent geopolitical analyst. Hi, Rich.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
It's so nice to have you. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm an independent geopolitical analyst, as you mentioned. I've also had experience in research, 5 years in research, both institutional and independent. I used to be a part of the Armenian national basketball team in 2015 and in 2016, which in 2016 I captained. And yeah, I've been to 32 countries, I guess, is something I really like to tell people. Just for those who are itching to travel, I definitely want you to do that. So that's a big part of my life, and that's who I am in a very nutshell.
And you're of Armenian American descent, correct?
Precisely, yes. I was born in Orange County, raised in Glendale, moved back in Armenia in 2006 to 2009, and then I moved back to Burbank, California. So Armenian American is the ideal answer for that.
Can you maybe tell us, given that you are a member of our community here, and you have both ties to two different countries, how has your culture and heritage shaped who you are today, and what is that you do?
Yeah, I mean, being an Armenian American, it's almost like a paradox, right? You come from a space where it's highly connected to the Russian identity in a political sense, but at the same time, you live in the free world of the United States. And it constantly, you're reminded of this situation, right? Given that, you know, the United States, when we're speaking in a geopolitical idea, you have the United States an alliance with countries like Turkey that, you know, as we know, April, you know, Armenian History Month, it has the, you know, it encourages our locals to understand the history between Armenians and the Turks and how, you know, difficult the tragedy was for the Armenians. But ultimately, we received our own state under Russian, you know, leadership during the Soviet Union, and then ultimately now as an independent state. So, you know, being a member in the Armenian American community in Glendale, it's roughly easy, I would say. However, I've also had living experiences in San Francisco, which finding an Armenian is scarce. So it's commonly we're mixed up with Romanians, given the name and how similar it is. But in terms of then comes the identity, right? When it comes to filling out the ballot, are we white? Are we not? You know, are we Middle Eastern? What is it, right? And you're constantly living in this world where, well, since 9/11, we might not be considered what's seen on the ballot, but at the same time, we fit the, you know, the narrative, and that's of course on a legal basis considered in the late 1800s. So yeah, it's a constant battle with an identity almost, and especially with living in Armenia. In Armenia, it's pretty clear what your identity is, but when you're living abroad as a part of a diaspora of 8 million, which is much more than the country Republic of Armenia that is of close to 2.8 million, which is also dwindling. It's, you know, it's very difficult, but at the same time, we're thankful given our history and the fact that we've made it this far.
And you mentioned that diaspora. For the listeners, can you explain a little bit about what it is to be part of this Armenian community in the diaspora?
Yeah, so an Armenian, a part of the diaspora is essentially an Armenian that just lives abroad away from the Republic of Armenia. So you can see various influxes that this happened even in the late 1800s under the Hamidian massacre, where many Armenians found refuge in different locations, meaning that whether it was Fresno, Boston, Detroit, New York, you know, the main hubs at the time. After the Armenian genocide took place from 1915s all the way until early 1920s, you found Armenians living in France, given the allies of Armenia at the time, or I guess I should say the enemies of the Ottoman Empire, later Turkey. They found refuge in those alliance locations.
And you also mentioned Armenian History Month, or April 24th, you referenced that. Can you tell us a little bit about that history?
Yeah, so to my understanding, the LA County has officially recognized the month of April as Armenian History Month, which is big, given that the Armenian presence is enormous in Los Angeles. It's great to see our allies in Los Angeles finding a place for us to commemorate our history and to also spread awareness, given that, you know, the word genocide in itself was coined from the Armenian genocide.
Thank you for explaining that so clearly. Now, you have a rather significant social media presence. Can you tell us about your start and what is the mission that you have?
So with social media, I was, as a college student, as many college students, right, you find a side supplementary income, right? So I was doing social media management, and I started to learn how users and consumers were really operating with social media. And unfortunately, social media, not all accounts are created equally. And I like to say it that way. So when you realize there's a certain way of how people take in information, like, for example, comedy, right? When I think of all the commercials we see, the Geico commercials, the State Farm commercials, it's all based around comedy. And it's transferring some kind of information from point A to point B. So when I, started making comedy, I want to say in 2020, February, that was gaining traction. However, in July, the skirmishes began between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And that's when I wanted to kind of utilize my geopolitical background, given that my research was kind of under the rug. I didn't want to release it much. I wasn't too confident with with how people would take that information, given that it's a lot all at once, right? It's all about war. But July kind of amped it. And so I transferred my comedic page into a satirical page where people would be able to take in information similar to how George Carlin would do it in the 80s, the 90s, and of course before that. Thankfully, Armenians all across the world, from Denmark all the way to India, we're picking up on it and starting to learn much more about the geopolitical nuances of the Caucasus region.
I know that we've talked a lot about the feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, especially when the fighting was happening in Artsakh. How has this changed the community at large?
Well, it's very difficult, right? Given that the Armenian people essentially witnessed the first drone warfare taking place in Artsakh, Nagorno-Karabakh, which was almost, it's difficult to watch, but you're looking at war essentially online. Watching Google Earth update these pictures and noticing that parts of what was Artsakh is now under Azeri control. Not to mention that, but here's the mental strain that I see. I mean, of course, many of us have the transgenerational trauma existing since the Armenian genocide days. And that our grandparents would tell us the stories, and it's just horrific, right? Like, for example, my great-grandpa had to restart a family after noticing his family was slaughtered, and he had to go to Tbilisi, Georgia to start a new one. And that's where my bloodline begins. So it's difficult to see Turkey more than 105 years later coming back and supplying drone warfare, supplying intelligence to Azerbaijan to kill more Armenians 105 years later. So the mental strain is immense. I mean, and I'm not even gonna lie, I was having my own issues, which I hadn't had prior to that. So it becomes a lot of information that you're consuming, and there is no real regulation on how much information a person can consume when the internet is so accessible. All you need is some subscription, or not even that, just a website.
Like you mentioned, Glendale, Southern California, Los Angeles, huge Armenian community. And if you're not Armenian, you probably know somebody who is Armenian. And chances are that person probably had a very difficult year, in addition to everybody who has had a very difficult time adjusting to this pandemic. During this time, the Armenians were going through a major crisis. What can we do to support one another here, support our friends?
Mental support, ask them how they're doing. It's very tough to see during a pandemic, a war break out, while simultaneously you have the financial hardships, you have the mental hardships and all that. But just overall seeing a couple of friends not ask me, I reached out to them and I was like, hey, like, just out of curiosity, why not? Like, I'm interested to know, because I reached out in cases like, whatever it is. And, they said, we just feel like we don't know enough, and we don't know how to react. And sometimes that part of the world, it seems like there's always a war. And that's when I understood that the privileges we have in the United States, that we haven't seen war on our soil since probably the Civil War, and that was against each other. That's when I took things into perspective, and I said, you know what, I need to do a better job to let my friends know that I am not doing okay. So, and that's when it started reciprocating. My friends and I, we just started talking about it, what these issues are, starting to talk about more like, what are some cool Armenians that have been around, like Cher. Cher is my favorite Armenian, right? Like, and her music, it brings people together. And that's I think just people asking us how we're doing when they're not of Armenian background, showing up to some civil events, vigils by any means, and then grabbing a beer afterwards it's always great, and I think that's where it is the mental support, because we understand you're not gonna move to Armenia and fight on the front lines. No, that we're not asking for that, and quite frankly, a lot of us wish we could do that ourselves too. But mental support is the biggest thing that I'm starting to learn more and more on a daily basis.
As we wrap up here, do you think that you might be able to share with us maybe an inspirational moment, time, something that you found really helped get you through this and help further motivate you?
You know what it was? I want to say in Glendale, and I live in Hollywood, so it's, I don't get to see the Armenian community as prominently as I used to, because I grew up in Glendale. But when I was in a market, an Armenian market, just, one of those, pardon me, but the OG kind, right? Where it says like Arman's market or like an Armenian name market. And I walked in, and then the grandmother in Armenian goes like, Facebook nerits, which translates to, are you the kid from one of those Facebooks? And I said, yeah, I am. And then she takes off her mask and walks a little far away, for distancing. And then she goes like, can you explain to me what's happening in Armenia? And I was like, you know what, like if this person felt comfortable enough to just in person, just like reach out and be like, hey, like what's happening, because a lot of my content is in English. Yeah. It makes me happy that I can make that, change in this world. And just that made me feel really good about myself, given that a lot of the friends I made during the war, unfortunately, right? We still made some friends, which is great, but I mean, yeah, it didn't feel like it was real until I met the people. And that was the hard part about the pandemic. So seeing people just realizing the work I do, it gave me much more of a boost. It gave me much more confidence to do it more commonly, because and kind of, you know, create my craft to the people. And that's something inspirational for me, and for anyone that feels like their work isn't appreciated, or you know, through whatever they're doing. I feel like it is. It's just you can't see them right now. Wait till you can, and that's the inspiration I can leave with, given the circumstances we're in right now.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for everything that you've taught us and for joining us today. And maybe you can do something for our frontline workers here.
Oh,
have you.
Anything. You guys are awesome over there. Truly.
Thank you.
So we are now joined by Sevak Ohanian, who's a screenwriter and a producer. Hi, Sev.
Hi, Talene. So nice to have you, or so nice to be here, I should say.
So nice to have you on the show. So tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, I'm a screenwriter and producer in Hollywood, which sounds so weird to say it. I grew up in Los Angeles. I was born in Germany. My parents, I immigrated to LA when I was 4 months old. Grew up in like Sunland, which is not too far from here. And then we moved to Glendale when I was in high school, which, you know, is our rite of passage, of course, as Armenians. And when I was in high school, my dream was to be a filmmaker. And while we lived relatively close to Hollywood, it felt a billion miles away because, you know, didn't have any family connections, didn't have like enormous amounts of wealth, which is usually nice to have if you want to do film. But I decided to settle for journalism because it felt like a safe alternative choice. I became the editor-in-chief of my high school newspaper. I interned at the LA Times. But when I was going to college at UC San Diego, which, you know, for journalism, I made a little short film just for fun with my friend, kind of poking fun at our parents in Armenian. We put it on YouTube for like my 20 friends to check out. And to my shock, when I got back from a haircut, I think, like literally hundreds of views, thousands of views, tens of thousands of views. It got so crazy big and viral that it kind of, you know, was alarming. And it was a video I made with my dad's camera, just really funny. Like imagine an Armenian dad yelling at his kid. And then we were like, let's make a second one. And that got even more popular. And we decided that as a follow-up, we would make a feature film. So I wrote a movie called My Big Fat Armenian Family, spent $800, used my dad's home video camera. I wrote, directed, produced, edited, shot, every single thing except for makeup. And I always say this, like the makeup artist quit, so I did that too. And we made this thing, like I said, for $800. And then it was a story about old-fashioned Armenian parents from the old country and their two young teenage kids who are very Americanized and a little bit resentful of their Armenian tradition. And what happens when this family goes on a weekend trip to Palm Springs, or as they say, Palm Springs.
Oh my God, that's you.
That's me. Yeah. And
oh my God. Wait a second. Are we talking about it's Gangstera?
Yep, that's me. Oh, Hamar, cool, Hamar. That's the one.
Oh my God. All right. So I just had our production crew. I was like, you got to watch this video. I watched this video a bajillion times. I laughed so hard. Watch this. And was this made 14 years ago?
Oh my God. Yeah. 2007, 2008. That's wow. 14 years.
I watched this yesterday.
Are you serious? That's crazy.
I'm not joking. I was like, this is the thing that I watched over and over and over again. And I laughed so hard. I cried because this was my family.
Yes. Same. So that was my first thing. That was my first thing ever. So we made the movie based on that and sold tickets at Glendale High, sold DVDs around the world, and it made an enormous amount of money, which was never, like I had no business plan. I had no projections. But more than the money, which later helped me pay for USC, it was the fact that complete strangers, Armenians, like thousands of them in LA and around the world, had shown up for this little film thing I had thought of. And they were laughing at it, they were clapping, they were crying. it was amazing. Like that empowered me to actually give up on journalism, which was kind of like my backup idea anyway, and pursue filmmaking. It empowered me to kind of take that plunge. And shortly after I got into USC Film School as a graduate student, and that's where I got my master's in filmmaking.
That's so interesting. What a great story. And what are you doing nowadays? I know you're doing so many great projects. You can tell us about that?
Yeah, it's I've been really busy. You know, I was really lucky when I was at film school. I was, you know, I knew immediately I wanted to be a producer. I love being in charge, you know, being incredibly collaborative with the director and being able to have a lot of things going on at once. And I also love to write. And when I finished film school, I was able to be immediately a producer on a movie called Fruitvale Station. It was a small indie film. We got to Sundance. We won a bunch of awards there. It starred Michael B. Jordan, who blew up afterwards, went to the Cannes Film Festival at the South of France. It was amazing. And after that, I produced a whole bunch of little indies, and I eventually got my chance to produce a movie that I wrote and that I was the lead producer on, called Searching, which is a movie starring John Cho. It takes place on computers about a father searching for his missing daughter. And the way he finds her is he goes to her laptop and learns things about her that he never imagined he would. And that movie we made for about $1 million, also went to Sundance, won awards. Sony bought it and it made $75 million around the world, which is insane. And which is funny, I'm filming Searching 2 right now. We fly tomorrow to Colombia, the country, to continue filming it. But you know, since then, I produced a whole bunch of other movies, and I most recently executive produced a film called Judas and the Black Messiah, which was a true story about the Black Panther Party in Chicago in the 1960s. And it got nominated for 6 Academy Awards, which is the Oscars are on Sunday. So it's kind of insane to have a movie like that, you know, so relatively recently after graduating or whatever. And I got a movie called Space Jam: A New Legacy coming out this summer.
Well, congratulations to you, and you know, fingers crossed.
Thanks. It sounds crazy when I say it all in like 2 sentences, but that's like a lot of time and work. But yeah, thanks you, Tommy. That means a lot.
That is very impressive, and just hearing that sounds like so much work, such hard work and dedication. I wonder, having grown up here and being Armenian American, how do you think your heritage has affected or, you know, been part of where you are and who you are today?
Growing up Armenian has largely been formative to just who I am. Like I was incredibly active in Homenamen Arat Scouts for 10 years, you know, for half of that as a participant and the other half as a leader. And more than that, I do find that as a collective people, Armenians, almost by virtue of necessity, assume really entrepreneur type roles in a lot of endeavors that we have. You know, we're a relatively small population spread across the world in a diaspora, obviously due to our tragic history. And it has given me an incredibly clear sense of identity. I do know, you know, I guess I'm an artist, and a lot of the artists that I work with, I know that a lot of what art is like finding out who you are and like learning that so that you can then apply that to make more art. I've never had to ask myself that question because just growing up as an Armenian and surrounded with my family, my community, I knew who I was right away. And I think that knowing that has kind of been like my northern light. It's been the compass for me as far as like knowing who you are makes it so much easier to then focus on what matters as an artist. And I don't know, I think one thing that I know people have said about me is my work ethic has always been something I get a lot of praise for. And I don't know why. Maybe you can help me with this as talking as a psychiatrist, but I can't help but connect my work ethic with me being an Armenian. Mm-hmm. Whether it's we are ultimately survivors of genocide, you know, we're basically descendants of genocide survivors. So it's like, does that mean that we have to work that much harder to you know, help our people? Because if we don't do it, well, I don't know. Now I'm just rambling, but generally I do feel like it's been very informative. And the last thing I will say is, in the film industry, our reputation is so many things. I definitely have the reputation of being Sev, that Armenian guy. And I think, to me, I wear that with pride. I talk about being Armenian everywhere. I find some way to connect it to Armenians, whatever we're talking about. So if anything, I appreciate it for giving me that notoriety.
That's great. And, you know, that's so interesting that you bring that up. This was a discussion I was having actually earlier today with another Armenian colleague, of this idea of mediocrity was never part of the option or the plan. We always had to be better than that, because it is a sense of survival. There's so few of us that that we needed to make a difference, essentially, is what we felt on the inside.
Absolutely.
And I wonder, in the past year, our culture, our community has seen such tragedy. How has that affected you and even your industry, do you think?
For me, it was harrowing. You know, I went from hardly really using social media to just constantly posting, trying to educate, donating, money, donating time. I found myself very quickly as part of a small collective of various artists in the film and television industry, working together to try and come up with, PSAs or campaigns. I got very active on Twitter. It was crazy, like I know people who were directly impacted in Armenia and Artsakh, and there was really not much I could do to protect people's safety. But I did see that in addition to the war and the attacks perpetuated against civilians, on top of all that, there was a whole propaganda machine in action, and it was actually incredibly admirable, like that how incredibly efficient the Azeri or Turk or whatever it was, like machine was operating, like the amount of bots they had, the incredibly almost elegant way that they sowed confusion and twisted words and made it so that mass populations, couldn't really know what was going on. And wait, is Armenia's kind of the bad guy? And how they were attacking any celebrity that spoke out in defense of Armenia. It was horrifying. So I think, to me, I just made a movie about the Black Panthers, and one of the Black Panther members today tells me, like, the bullets of the movement in the civil rights era killed them, but the words hurt them. And I think, I try to do my best to help fight that propaganda, but there was only so much we could do. And I just take solace in the fact that it's not over, and there's a lot left to overcome on both ends. And yeah, I was everyone who I would talk to for like 3 months, they knew all about it. I promise you that.
And April 24th is right around the corner, and it's such an important day for the Armenian community and Armenian culture. Recognition of the Armenian genocide has always been something that we've been striving for. Why do you think this year is so important, and where do you think we go from here?
Great question. I think every year is important, but I think this year is undeniably extra important because, for a number of reasons. Number one, obviously the attack last year was devastating on so many levels. And again, like, I think part of what was especially harmful was just the rhetoric used by the enemy to kind of create this idea that, oh, the Armenians kind of started it and they're the bad guys. And all of it boils back down to the Armenian genocide. I think if President Biden says the word genocide, which I do believe he will, it is going to change the dynamic in a major way. I hate that sometimes the underdogs, all we get are scraps. Victory is a word being said to describe, like, an obvious word. Yes, you describe that as a genocide. Or in the case of, yesterday, we're recording this on Wednesday, but yesterday was the George Floyd murder, the case about the cop that murdered him. He was convicted as being guilty. And to me, again, obviously he was guilty. He killed a man in broad daylight, but we have to celebrate that because no matter how small the victory it is one. I do think Biden is going to say it. I think we've seen, if you follow politics, that the Turkish-US relations have not been as good as they used to be. I think there's a lot less to lose for America to actually win at this time, but I do think it's one of those things that once that word is said, it can't be unsaid, and it will change the dynamic because so much of the rhetoric happening online by the genocide deniers their arguments will be a lot weakened. And I think, again, hopefully it's just the first step. Whether it's reparations or honestly, whether it's just worldwide, putting a spotlight on the crimes that were once committed so they can't again be committed once more as they were a few months ago. I'm hopeful. I'm really, really optimistic, and I'm choosing to see this as a good moment in a sea of a lot of bad ones.
How do you think that your friends, your non-Armenian friends, colleagues, have responded to what's been going on? And what message might you have for the listeners who aren't Armenian about how this is affecting their friends and what they can do to help?
It's tough because the inactions of friends who are not Armenian, I think it's easy to write that off as apathy, that they don't care or they don't believe. I don't have that view though. I think the world is sadly full of tons of incredibly urgent, tragic matters that require everyone's attention. And everyone only has so much attention to give to every tragic thing that's happening around them. I think especially now with the pandemic, I know a lot of people who didn't protest because there was concerns about the pandemic, and I do not blame them at all. All I can say is we all have roles to play. I think the Black Lives Matter movement is an incredible movement, and it's one that is hundreds of years in the making. Like, that did not happen overnight. And it's sad that it even has to happen, because it's unfortunately necessary with the horrific systemic racism and just insanely awful acts of violence constantly perpetuated against Black Americans. Our struggle is also not a new one, but it's going to take time for our moment to become a movement. And I think, once again, everyone just has to do their part. I think it's important to, as much as possible, continue to lift ourselves up outside of our cause and reach places in all of our fields of work that are of excellence, whether it's people wanting to be politicians or CEOs or whatever it is. I think reaching places of influence for yourself, again, in that hominum way of Bartatiri, Bartaturu, lift yourself to lift others, that's going to take time, but I do know we can get there. It's funny, like I looked on, like, there's this website I use all the time called tvtropes.org. It's like, where it has all sorts of like storytelling tidbits and stuff like that. There was like a list of famous Armenians, and that list is enormous. Like, Armenians have really done a great job in just 100 years since this genocide and establishing ourselves as leaders in so many industries. And you look at like famous, insert other country name here, and it's just not as long. I do believe, as long as we continue to do good work and we all act as good citizens of whatever country we're from, whether it's America or anywhere, over time, the net effect of everyone collectively doing their part will make a difference.
That's very wise and a hopeful mission. And I appreciate you sharing your thoughts and feelings on that. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Taline. This is really fun. Thank you for all the great questions.
We are joined by Dr. Shushan Karapetian, Deputy Director of the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. Hi, Dr. Garapedian.
Hi, Dr. K.
It's so nice to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about your role and the Institute?
Sure. So the Institute of Armenian Studies is a research institute at the University of Southern California dedicated to exploring contemporary Armenian identity, the contemporary Armenian experience post-genocide. So that's something that's very unique among Armenian departments and institutes kind of all over the West, all over the world, is that we focus on modern day Armenia, the modern day diaspora, making sure those two understand each other, understand each other's needs, and don't kind of pass each other in their longing for one another. And basically what we do is we support scholarship on Armenia and the diaspora, and equally as important, we make that scholarship accessible to folks outside of academia so that that scholarship actually has consequence on the ground.
And when you're talking about the modern day Armenia post-genocide, what does that actually mean?
So that means the Republic of Armenia as it exists now. And that means the diaspora created after 1915. So basically the last 100 and some years.
So the mission of this town hall is really, the idea is to try to break over 100 years of silence. And how do we go about doing that? And you at the Institute obviously play a very crucial role in this. Where do you think, first of all, can we talk a little bit about the history and how it has shaped us as a community?
Absolutely. It's interesting. I'm teaching a class this semester called the Armenian Heritage, History, Arts, and Culture. And one of the things we're exploring is kind of the Armenian narrative, right? What's the story that we tell ourselves about our own history, and what's the story that others impose on us? So, and it's kind of not a contradictory story, but it has different nodes. There is we're the first, we're the chosen, we're the unique ones, right? So we're a very ancient people. We're the first Christian nation, so the first nation to adopt Christianity. We have one of the earliest alphabets. You know, we were among these great empires that eventually disappeared, but we survived. So there is this sense of kind of uniqueness of being chosen. But at the same time, we were always the little power among big powers, really playing the game of survival, really trying to survive and to kind of be flexible. And, you know, kind of geographically, we're not in a good neighborhood. We're kind of the apple that every competing empire wants. So there's also the narrative of victimhood and oppression. So again, it's this chosen unique first, and then constantly oppressed, constantly tried to be eradicated, the victim by the larger powers, the kind of a war zone among greater powers. So there's kind of these competing narratives that we tend to deal with. And then after the genocide, of course, the genocide is kind of the big moment of rupture, right? Where there was almost complete erasure. And as Razmik Panosyan, you know, historian, articulates, it's become the cornerstone of Armenian identity. And that's a tough pill to swallow, I think, for young people to think that, you know, the first thing you associate with being Armenian is a genocide. I'm hoping we're stepping out of that, but I think for many people that really is the defining element. And that's something I try to challenge. Yes, the Armenian genocide is an essential component of being Armenian, but it is not the beginning or end of Armenian identity. We are much more than the Armenian genocide.
I couldn't agree with you more. It really is how we define ourselves, and it's so ingrained in us as individuals. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on what happened in Artsakh in Armenia just a few months ago, and kind of this tragedy that we continue to relive, and it just happened not that long ago. How does that come into play with the genocide and where we go as a group and our identity?
Yeah, you know, recently we had a DEI event at USC, and we proposed a panel on the Artsakh war and this kind of sense of recycled trauma. So we had Beth Meyerowitz, a psychologist, talk about the kind of role of intergenerational trauma and how such deep historical trauma really frames the way we experience and see new traumas. So especially given the explicit Turkish participation in the 2020 Karabakh war, I think all of a sudden the existential angst that Armenians had felt during the genocide and post-genocide just came back immediately, rushed back. That once again, there is this small ethno-religious minority that is being persecuted by a larger neighbor, now kind of on both sides. And even the rhetoric of genocide was being used. So Erdogan saying, we're going to start what we finished in 1915, right? Or Turkish folks hounding Armenians all over the diaspora saying, Armenian dogs, your end is coming. So I think really genocide informs the way that Armenians process more contemporary traumas. And this kind of constantly being in survival mode, constantly being on the lookout for it, in fear of erasure.
And we have a major Armenian American community here in Southern California, specifically in Los Angeles. How do you think, and we're talking about something that occurred thousands of miles away, but it affected the community here and all over the world. How do you think this has affected the Armenian community here and the community at large, even non-Armenians?
Yeah, I think, okay, so this community is very unique in that it is comprised of lots of sub-communities, right? There's kind of the old post-genocide Armenian American community. There are the Armenians that went to the Middle East after the genocide and then became second or third diasporas in the US. And then there are the post-Soviet Armenians like myself, right? Born either in Soviet Armenia or independent Armenia who came. So there's all these like subgroups within the LA Armenian community. And we have very different relationships to Armenia and to homeland, right? The old Armenian Americans, their homeland is not necessarily the Republic of Armenia. It's Western Armenia, which is current, modern day Eastern Turkey. Whereas my homeland is Yerevan, right? Yeah. So one, for that last group, the group like my family who came from Armenia, we have family members in Armenia. We have cousins and brothers and teachers and friends who went to war. So we're on the phone on a daily basis, inquiring about the well-being of our family members. For the traditional diaspora, this is, whether this is their actual homeland or a kind of new homeland, still it is this global Armenian event, right? That's kind of defining the Armenian narrative. Mm-hmm. So, and again, especially with the Turkish participation, all of a sudden we noticed this group of Armenians waking up that hadn't been engaged with their Armenian identity. It's interesting when you look at history, once a group is persecuted or oppressed, they actually start identifying with their ethnic compatriots much strongly than before. Like if you look at Armenians in the Russian Empire or Ottoman Empire 100 or so years ago, it was only after they started closing Armenian schools, taking away Armenian properties, that Armenians were like, wait a minute, our language is really important. And we should really, challenge this.
Preserve this, yeah.
It's kind of, a similar thing happened with some folks who were like, I'm Armenian when I like it, but when I don't, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait, they're trying to wipe us out? Wait a minute.
Wait a second.
What do I need to do? I need to do something. So really, and that event that I mentioned, the DEI event, we called it the war that came to Los Angeles. And the other thing that I think we don't take into consideration is 30 years ago, we had the first war, right? In the early 90s. And there were some of us in Yerevan who didn't have day-to-day updates like folks in Los Angeles had a couple of months ago. The kind of advances in technology and communication brought this war to our cell phones, where we were watching these violent crimes, these violent, horrific crimes against humanity day and night. So I think that kind of barrage of really frontline warfare traumatized us in a way that we hadn't experienced before.
I wonder, for our non-Armenian listeners, how do you think that they can help support their Armenian friends, neighbors, colleagues?
That's a great question. One, I think it's acknowledging that, your Armenian friend, colleague, neighbor is going through something, because sometimes the reactions people get is like, well, do you have family or friends? Like in my case, I do, but I have a lot of friends, Armenian friends, who don't. And for them, it's still as heart-wrenching, as devastating as it is for me. So it's hard for folks to understand diasporan identity, that you may live outside of a homeland that you may not even have been to or have family members, but that forms a kind of essential core of your identity. So I think just acknowledging that something happening thousands of miles away is having a devastating impact on someone here in LA is very, very important. The other thing is, this is human rights violations. These are war crimes. So whether this is happening to an Armenian or a non-Armenian should concern each of us who care about the well-being of human beings all over this world. So I think really acknowledging and just even asking for information. It's okay if you don't know. We all don't know every war and every atrocity that's happening in the world. I think sometimes we're so scared of engage, ask people, ask them what's going on. How are you doing? What can I do? What can I learn?
Absolutely. And thank you. You're absolutely right. It's if you don't know, ask, and people are willing to talk and share. And really, this is a time, I think, more than ever, where social injustices are brought to light and people are willing to have that conversation.
Absolutely.
Now, April, can we talk about the month of April and April 24th, and what does that mean this year now more than ever?
So April 24th is the day we commemorate the Armenian genocide. It's the day that the Ottoman Turks decapitated the brain, right? So when you think about genocide, it's very systematic and very premeditated. And there were several steps, right? Step one was take away the weapons from the men, send them to camps, massacre them. So the muscle is gone. And then gather all of the intellectuals, all of the people who potentially have leadership power, and decapitate the brain. And then, of course, you get to the body, right? The women, the children, and the elderly. They're marched off and starved to death or massacred along the way. So April 24th is the day that these intellectual leaders were gathered and imprisoned and then eventually massacred. This year, April 24th takes an extra special meaning because all of these young soldiers that we lost are have now joined this group of martyrs, and it's interesting that we consider them martyrs. When I was in Armenia just a couple of weeks ago, and my first day I went to Yerabluj, which is this military cemetery, and you hear on the news, right? You hear 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 18 to 20-year-olds. But then you go and you see each grave, right? You see these images of these teenage boys, and you see these families, these mothers, these fathers, friends, just kind of staring at the graves in complete shock and in complete horror at the loss. So I think this year is a particularly hard year in that, now we have an extra couple of thousand people and they're very, very young.
And it's what happens to the next generation due to this is a whole other
Absolutely. There's a whole generation of young men missing. So there's a whole generation of parents without sons. There's a whole generation of women without partners, without husbands, fiancés, boyfriends, brothers. There's a whole generation of children without fathers. The consequences of this will be felt for a very long time.
I don't even know what the word is. Extra horrific, if that even encompasses what I'm trying to say, that this happens during a pandemic where we are all in survival mode and we are all trying to just kind of figure out the best way to get through. And then you add a war on top of it, and really there's total chaos.
Yeah, and I don't think that was an accident, right? This was timed perfectly. There was a global pandemic. Most countries were in chaos dealing with the pandemic on their home front. There was an election in the United States. So I think it was very strategically timed.
How do you think mental health comes into play? There's obviously a need to process, cope, heal. And what do you think about the Armenian community, both in the diaspora and in Armenia proper, but more specifically here, in the same way that you were talking about it, it affected each Armenian member in the same significant kind of way, even though it was different?
Yeah.
How do you respond?
I think the good news is that the stigma that mental health had before is no longer as strong or as kind of prominent. I think more people are open to seeking help for mental health issues. One area of amazing diaspora engagement during the war and after the war has been mental health professionals all over the diaspora reaching out to mental health professionals in Armenia, offering training, offering support, offering anything and everything they can give. Here in LA, I think people were already struggling, like you mentioned, with the pandemic, with lockdown, with quarantine. So a lot of us were really suffering. Whether you want to call it intergenerational trauma, whether you want to call it PTSD, whether you want to call it loneliness, isolation, depression, fear. I mean, the other day someone said, can you have secondhand war trauma? There was an Armenian in Dallas who said, every time I see an airplane, I think it's a drone,
Wow.
right, falling down on me. So I think mental health is a very serious issue. I think more people are open to seeking help, although I can imagine that so much more is needed.
Absolutely. And how do you think you as an individual, how has your heritage shaped who you are today and the position you have today?
Yeah, so the joke at our institute, especially with our director, Salpi Ghazarian, and myself, is that we are professional Armenians, right? So I remember the first time I stepped foot into a classroom at Glendale Community College. I was 23, I was teaching my first class. And I realized that moment that I stood in front of the class, that for some people, I may be their first and only exposure to Armenianness, right? That this feeling of like being an ambassador to all things Armenian. And it was so overwhelming in a positive way, but overwhelming nonetheless, that I had to carry this like responsibility of representing. So, I mean, as someone who was born in Armenia, I think I had the privilege of taking my Armenian identity for granted because I was a human being who was born in Armenia. So I happened to be Armenian. Very different when you're born in the diaspora, right? Because when you're born in the diaspora, you're born with the burden of proving your Armenianness because you can't, it's not de facto. You can't take it for granted. You have to perform it. You have to prove it. And then when we moved to the US, I remember when I had my first daughter, my husband teased me and said, when did you become a diasporan? And I said, the moment I had a child and I was burdened with not just raising a good human, but a good Armenian human. Again, I envy my friends in Armenia, right? They just raise good children. Are Armenian, right? Even if they want to be something else, they kind of can't. Whereas here in the diaspora, we have a choice. Right? We have these hybrid identities. So I think my Armenian heritage went from kind of background to foreground as I transitioned from being Armenian in Armenia to Armenian in the US. And it's funny, when I'm in the US, I'm hyper Armenian. And then when I'm in Armenia, I'm kind of hyper American.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. But I kind of embrace it all, right? I feel that, and that's something I tell my kids. I feel so fortunate that I have both. It's never an either or for me. It's a both and for me. And I feel the richer for it.
Absolutely. For our non-Armenian listeners who may want to get involved and help support their Armenian friends, what can they do?
Again, I think what people want is engagement. Really, at the end of the day, we all just want to feel that we're heard and that we're seen. So make sure you're kind of up to date on what's going on with your Armenian friends and neighbors. And if you're not, ask, like I mentioned before, ask and put yourself out there. I know we all kind of shy away from being vulnerable, but sometimes it's in our most vulnerable states that we make these kind of amazing connections. And you'll be amazed. I know, the psychologist I mentioned earlier on, Beth Meyerowitz, talked about, intergenerational trauma and how it is constantly places us in kind of survival mode. But the flip side of that coin is that, one, we're very resilient, two, we're very compassionate. Because we've had a front row seat to the horrors of this world. So it's almost like you can't shock us, right? We've seen it all. We've been through it all. So I think at the core of it is engagement. Mm-hmm. Engagement, understand that on April 24th, when Armenians are marching and you're annoyed that there's traffic, Don't be annoyed. Think about why they're doing that. Or during the war, when Armenians, marched and closed off the freeways. I know it's a nuisance, right? It's a nuisance for people who are driving and want to get home. But if you understand the context, if you understand that there is these young men who are just, there are drones falling on top of them, and it's their sisters and mothers and cousins and compatriots who are doing this, you might have a very different perspective of what these people are going through.
Absolutely. Very well said. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts and your wisdom, and for everything that you do and the Institute.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure having you this evening.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you would like to get involved, please join the hashtag #YesIt'sGenocide movement and reach out to your fellow colleagues for support. In addition, please remember to subscribe to our LAC USC Medical Center YouTube channel so that you can see upcoming town halls and our House Calls with Dr. K podcast for upcoming episodes. Thank you.